He was a shadow paid to do a rich man's dirty work, but he wasn't supposed to be her killer. Tonight, he was supposed to be her savior. This is a story about a man with nothing, a woman with everything, and the lie that was about to burn it all to the ground. It's a story about how sometimes the only way to find justice is to become the monster everyone already thinks you are. If this story gets its hooks in you, do me a favor and help us get to 1 million subscribers. Your support keeps these tales alive. Now let's head to Red Bluff, Colorado. The year is 1878, and the dust is about to settle. The dust in Red Bluff didn't just move, it had a memory. It coiled under doors and settled in the lungs of men who learned early that silence was cheaper than talk. Nico Blackstone, Apache by blood, ghost by trade, leaned against the polished post rail of the Dane estate. His arms were folded over a chest that looked like it was carved from the same hard canyon rock he rode through every day. He'd spent the morning tracking a shipment of rifles Judge Dane swore had been stolen. But Nico knew the truth. The judge's enemies weren't common thieves. They were men just like Nico, men made desperate by a world that was stealing their land, their history, their very breath. And now as the sun bled out across the horizon, he was back, not to rest, but to stand watch over a home that tolerated him but had never, ever welcomed him. High above, lanterns swayed on the porch of the great white house. Music drifted down, broken pieces of piano notes and thin laughter. Tonight was Leona Dane's engagement supper. She was being promised, like a parcel of land, to the mayor's son, a man with a stiff jaw and hands that had never known a day of real work. Nico, of course, wasn't on the guest list. He never was. For 9 long years he had served the judge, first as a tracker, then a fixer, then something darker, something that didn't have a name. His loyalty was a tool, his silence, an insurance policy. But it didn't matter how many messes he cleaned up, how many border disputes he smothered before they could catch fire. In the judge's eyes, he was still the savage. Useful, but never ever trusted. He was only 17 the first time he'd seen her. Leona. She was just a girl then, barefoot in the orchard, her face dappled with sun. And unlike her father, her gaze held curiosity, not cruelty. She had looked at him, really looked, and she hadn't flinched. That one small act had made her unforgettable. Now she was 24, and she wore her defiance like a second skin. The years had sharpened her features, but her eyes held the same quiet intelligence, the same trapped fire. He could see her now, framed in a window by velvet curtains, listening to her future husband talk. She was nodding, smiling in all the right places, but Nico could see it. He could see the hollowness behind her eyes. Her gaze flickered, finding his for a split second across the manicured lawn. Something passed between them, a silent acknowledgement, a shared cage. He turned away before it could become something more, something dangerous. Later that night, the party died. The music faded, the laughter thinned out. Back in the stark, lonely bunkhouse, Nico stripped off his trail-worn clothes. He washed in a tin basin, the water turning the color of rust. It was a surface-level clean. The real dirt, the kind the judge paid him to collect, that stuff never came off. He sat on his cot, bare feet on the cold wood floor, listening to the estate settle into a nervous quiet. Then he heard it, a soft thud from the main house, muffled voices, the sound of something heavy being scraped across the dirt. In an instant, he was on his feet, knife in hand. He slipped out into the moonlight, a shadow moving through other shadows. The estate was quiet, too quiet. And then he saw it, near a servant's door. The disturbed dirt, a fresh set of boot tracks, and a drag mark. His blood went cold. He didn't think, he ran. Past the gardens, through the orchard where he'd first seen her, down the slope to the edge of the lower fields. Near the ravine he found it, a scrap of pale silk, torn from a dress. Leona's dress. The tracks led east. 3 horses, maybe 4. They were moving fast. They were heading for the Badlands. A place with no law, no mercy, just dry gulches and men who answered to no one. He sprinted back to the stables, his heart a hammer against his ribs. His Mustang Ghost sensed it too. eyes wide and breath snorting in the dark. He saddled the horse with lightning speed. No supplies, no food, just his rifle, his knife, and a cold, deep rage that had been sleeping for 9 years. As he rode past the main house, he saw a light glowing in the judge's study. He heard voices. He reined Ghost in, dismounting, and crept toward the window, staying low in the shadows of the porch. "She's gone," a man said. "Taken." A pause. Then the judge's voice, flat and cold as a tombstone. "Let them take her." The other man sounded shocked. "But sir, the mayor, your alliance." And then the judge said the words that changed everything. The words that lit the fuse on Nico's soul. "She's not my blood," the judge said. "Never was. She's the price. That's all." Nico's world tilted, his breath caught in his chest. Leona, discarded, sold. A price to be paid. He didn't knock. He didn't shout. He swung himself back onto Ghost's saddle and rode into the night, a shadow on fire, with a promise etched in his heart. He would find her, and then he would tear Red Bluff apart. By dawn, Nico was deep in the Bluff trails, a place where the world was all sharp edges and unforgiving rock. He was following hoofprints that only a man like him could read, a language written in crushed stone and bent grass. He found a creek bed where the water had pooled around fresh prints. 3 horses, just as he thought. But something was off. One set of prints was shallower. That horse had been riderless, at least for a while. Then he saw it. A set of boot marks near the water's edge. One smaller than the rest. She had fought. She had stalled. A broken branch snagged with another thread of pale silk confirmed it. She was still alive. He pushed on, the sun a hot poker at his back. As the heat built, so did his fury. He remembered her face, the defiant set of her chin. He remembered how she had once found him in the library, tracing the words in a book he couldn't read. She had approached him, not with fear, but with a quiet challenge. "You should learn," she had said softly. "Your words are worth being written down." No one had ever spoken to him like that. Not his own people, not the men who paid him. In that moment, she had seen a man, not a tool. And now she was gone. Not for ransom, not for power. This was a house cleaning. The judge was tying up a loose end before it could unravel his whole world. And Nico knew, with a certainty that burned colder than any fire, that he was the only person on earth who would come for her. He would get her back, or he would die in the trying. The sun climbed, a merciless eye in a bleached white sky. By the time Nico reached the abandoned mining trail, the air was thick enough to chew. He'd crossed dry riverbeds and thorn-choked arroyos, following a trail that was now growing careless. The riders weren't trying to hide. They didn't think anyone was coming, or maybe they just didn't care. He crouched beside a hoofprint in the chalky soil. The spacing had changed. The horses had slowed. They were close. He scanned the terrain. Low brush, jagged rock walls, and ahead a narrow break in the cliffs. A blind passage, the perfect place for an ambush, or a hideout. He left Ghost tethered in a ravine and moved forward on foot, the rifle a familiar weight across his back, his blade loose in its sheath at his hip. The world was silent except for the drone of flies and the distant lonely cry of a hawk. Then he heard it. Voices, muted, echoing faintly from inside the stone. Laughter, a grunt, the sound of something heavy being dropped. He crept closer, his movements as silent as a falling leaf. A weathered opening appeared in the rock face, half hidden by a tangle of creosote brush. An old mine shaft, long abandoned, deep enough to hide men with no souls. He eased toward the opening, his ears straining, filtering the sounds. Inside, a man cursed. "Hold her still, damn it!" Another voice, crueler, slurred. "Girl ain't got the sense to scream no more?" Nico's vision narrowed to a single point. His entire world became the dark mouth of that cave. He counted 2 voices. Where was the third? Scouting, probably, or guarding the horses. It didn't matter. He couldn't wait. He didn't hesitate. He burst through the brush like a phantom. Blade first, a storm of silent vengeance. The first man was looking down at Leona, a cruel smirk on his face. He never even saw Nico. The blade slid under his ribs, a single perfect motion. The man's eyes went wide with a surprise that quickly turned to nothing. He crumpled to the dirt floor without a sound. The second man stumbled backward, his hand fumbling for the shotgun leaning against the wall. But Nico was already moving. He was a blur of motion, slamming into him, his fists like stone hammers. A punch to the jaw snapped the man's head back. Another to the throat crushed his windpipe. The man gurgled, falling, clawing at his neck as he choked on his own breath. Then silence. A heavy, ringing silence, followed by a shallow, ragged breath. Nico turned, and he saw her. Leona lay on the dirt floor, her wrist bound with coarse rope to a piton driven into the rock wall above her head. Her ankles were tied tight. Her dress was torn, stained with grime, and a smear of blood near her shoulder. Her skin was pale, bruised, but her eyes were open, dazed, terrified, but open. He crossed the small space in 2 strides. "Leona," he said, his voice a low rumble. "It's me, Nico." She blinked as if waking from a nightmare. She tried to speak, but only a small sound came out. He knelt beside her, his knife slicing through the ropes at her wrists in a single fluid movement. Her hands fell limply to her sides. As he moved to her ankles, he paused. He saw a dark stain on the inside of her dress, between her thighs. A cold, sick dread washed over him. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice tight, strained. Her eyes, which had been wide with shock, suddenly filled with tears, but not the kind he expected. She shook her head, a small, weak motion. "No," she whispered, her voice cracking. Not like that. It's my time." It took Nico a second to understand. Then the meaning of her words crashed through him. The blood. It wasn't from them. Relief, so powerful it almost buckled his knees, swept through him like a cool wind over a raging fire. "Oh," he murmured, his voice softening. "Okay." He didn't look away. He didn't act embarrassed. He simply finished cutting the ropes at her ankles, then helped her sit up, gently wrapping his worn coat around her trembling shoulders. "I thought," she started, her voice barely audible. "I thought you wouldn't come." "I did," he said. It was all that needed to be said. He helped her to her feet, but her knees gave way. He caught her effortlessly, lifting her into his arms as if she weighed nothing. She buried her face into his shoulder, her body racked with silent sobs as he carried her out of that dark place, back into the blinding light of day. They made camp in a narrow arroyo 5 miles from the mine, a defensible little pocket carved into the rock by 1,000 years of wind and water. Nico built a small, smokeless fire from dried roots and boiled water from his canteen in a tin cup. He handed it to her, his coat still draped over her shoulders. She drank slowly, her lips cracked and pale. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was heavy, filled with everything that had happened, everything that had been said and unsaid for years. "You knew where they'd go," she said finally, her voice stronger now. "I knew what kind of men they were," he replied, cleaning his knife with steady, deliberate hands. "This is where I'd hide if I didn't want to be found." She nodded, staring into the small flames. "Why did my fa—" She stopped herself. "Why did the judge send them?" Nico didn't answer right away. He finished wiping the blade clean and slid it back into its sheath. "Because you were no longer part of his plan," he said, his voice even. "And because you know too much." Her throat worked as she swallowed. "He always hated me," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "I just never knew how much." Nico looked up from the fire, his dark eyes meeting hers. "He's not your father, Leona." She blinked, confused. "What?" "I heard him," Nico said, the words coming out flat and hard. "He was talking to the mayor's man. He said you weren't his blood, said he wouldn't pay a dime to bring you back." She stared at him, her lips slightly parted as the truth settled over her like a shroud. "That's why," she breathed. "That's why he never came for me. That's why he always looked at me, like I reminded him of a lie." Nico didn't need to say anything. He knew that look. He'd lived under it for 9 years. She pulled his coat tighter around her, a fragile shield against a world that had just been ripped apart. "All this time," she said, her voice hollow, "I thought if I was just good enough, dutiful enough, he would finally see me, see that I mattered." Nico's gaze was unwavering. "You do matter," he said. "Just not to him." Her eyes burned, but no tears came. She was past tears. What was filling her now was something colder, harder, something that felt a lot like resolve. "He'll come after us," she said. It wasn't a question. "I know." She reached across the small fire, her fingers brushing against his. It was the first time she had ever touched him willingly. "I don't want to go back there." "You won't," he said, and it sounded like a vow. As dust settled, painting the canyon walls in shades of purple and orange, Nico cleaned his rifle and sharpened his knife. Leona lay wrapped in his bedroll, watching the first stars prick the darkening sky. The warmth of the fire licked at her face, but it was his quiet, steady presence nearby that made her feel safe for the first time in days. Not saved, not yet, but not alone. He didn't ask for thanks. He didn't speak of what came next. But as the wind whispered through the cliffs, they both knew. This was not the end. It was just the beginning. Red Bluff wasn't done with them, and they weren't done with Red Bluff. The sun rose slow and orange, casting long shadows across the scrubland. The quiet in the arroyo was deep, the kind of quiet that only comes after the fear has burned itself out. Leona stirred, the pain in her limbs a dull, constant ache. She sat up, her eyes immediately finding Nico. He was already awake, crouched at the edge of the bluff, scanning the horizon. His rifle rested beside him. He was as still as the rock he knelt on, but every line of his body was tense. He turned as if sensing her gaze. "You all right?" he asked, walking back to the dead fire. She nodded, pulling the coat tighter. "Sore, but alive. I slept." She paused. "I didn't dream. I'm not sure if that's a good thing." Nico coaxed a few twigs back to life, creating a small flame. "Means your body's still holding on. For now, that's enough." Leona watched him. "You always talk like you've lived 2 lifetimes." "I have," he said, and his tone left no room for questions. By mid-morning, they were moving. Nico rode ahead on Ghost, and Leona sat behind him, her hands holding onto his sides for balance. The Mustang moved with a steady, powerful rhythm, unbothered by the extra weight. They followed a narrow ridge trail that offered a dizzying view of Red Bluff in the distance, a tiny, insignificant cluster of buildings huddled under the shadow of a single white church steeple. Nico reined Ghost to a halt on a high outcrop. He pointed. "There, that's where we're going." Leona frowned, her body tensing. "Red Bluff? Nico, that's the last place." "Not into town," he cut her off. "To the edge. There's a man there. Someone I trust." He paused. "Mostly." Leona didn't argue. She just held on tighter as they started moving again, descending from the high country into the familiar, dangerous territory she had once called home. They reached the outskirts by dusk, sticking to overgrown back trails. A weathered cabin sat on a hill overlooking the town, tucked away behind a stand of wild oak. Smoke curled from its crooked chimney. Nico dismounted, helping Leona down before leading Ghost into a small corral. The air inside the cabin smelled of tobacco, old paper, and something sharp, like whiskey. Maps covered every wall, marked with grease pencil and strange symbols. "Glenn!" Nico called out. A moment later, a man emerged from a side room. He was grizzled and sharp-eyed, somewhere north of 60. He wore dusty suspenders and a holster that had seen better days. His left eye was made of glass. It stared off into a different room, a different time. "Well, damn," the man said, his one good eye sizing them up. "Didn't expect you back, Blackstone. And I sure as hell didn't expect you with her." "She needs a place to rest," Nico said, his tone leaving no room for debate. "Just for a day, maybe 2. Glenn's gaze narrowed on Leona. "You realize who her father is, don't you?" Leona stepped forward, her chin high. "I'm not his daughter," she said, her voice clear and cold. "Not anymore." Glenn looked from her defiant face back to Nico's stony expression. He let out a low whistle. "Trouble." Nico just nodded. "Coming fast." That night, Glenn gave them the side room. It was small, smelling of cedar and old leather. Leona collapsed onto the cot, the weight of the last 2 days finally crushing her. She was asleep before her head hit the pillow. Nico didn't sleep. He sat by the small window, his rifle across his lap, watching the distant lights of Red Bluff. How do you know him? Leona's voice was a soft whisper from the darkness. She wasn't asleep after all. Nico didn't turn. He used to be a ranger. Quit after the army burned my village. Said justice wasn't supposed to wear a government badge. And you trust him? He doesn't trust anyone, Nico said. But he respects the truth when he sees it. A long silence stretched between them. Nico, she said, her voice barely audible, when you heard them talking, the judge, was he always planning to sell me off? He finally turned his head, his profile silhouetted against the moonlight. I don't think he ever saw you as a daughter, Leona. He saw you as a ledger item. You were just a means to a contract, a way to seal a deal with the mayor. She let out a sharp, quiet breath. I used to pray in that church every single week, she whispered. I believed if I was just dutiful, if I just obeyed, God would make it all make sense. Maybe that's the problem, Nico murmured, his gaze turning back to the window. You were trying to make sense of something that was built on lies from the very beginning. The next morning, the smell of strong coffee filled the cabin. Glenn slapped a folded sheet of parchment down on the table in front of Nico. Got this from a clerk at the courthouse. Quiet kid. Owes me a favor. It's a copy of Dane's land deed updates from the last quarter. Nico unfolded the paper. It was a long list of names, some crossed out, others newly added. Leona came to stand beside him, her eyes scanning the document. Suddenly she gasped, her finger pointing to a specific entry. My mother's land, she whispered. It was supposed to be left in trust for me. Untouched. But it's here, Nico said, his finger tracing the line. Signed over to the judge. Leona's voice trembled with a new kind of rage. She died before he could ever take it. I remember her telling me she was leaving it for me. Her name should be on that deed, not his. Nico scanned the column, his eyes sharp. Look at the date. This was signed 2 months after she died. The air in the room grew cold. That's impossible, Leona breathed. He forged it, she said, the words like stones in her mouth. He never owned that land. He stole it from my mother. From me. And a man who cuts up the past and sells it for parts doesn't stop at land, Glenn muttered from the doorway. You need more than a forged deed. You need proof. Hard proof. Leona looked up at Nico, her eyes blazing with a fire he had never seen before. There's a safe, she said, in his study, hidden under a floorboard near the bookshelf. I've seen him go to it late at night, after his meetings. Nico nodded slowly, a plan already forming in his mind. Then we go tonight. That evening, under the cloak of a moonless sky, they rode back toward the Dane estate. They left the horses hidden in a ravine and approached on foot, moving like wraiths through the tall grass. The house was dark, most of the staff dismissed after the disastrous engagement party. The back servant's door was unlocked. The study smelled of stale cigar smoke and betrayal. Nico crossed the room, pulled back the heavy Persian rug, and pried up the floorboard with the tip of his knife. The safe was there, just as she'd said. Old, iron-bound, and silent. The combination? He asked, his voice a low whisper. Leona knelt beside him, her fingers trembling as she reached for the dial. He was arrogant. He always used the year he bought his judge's robe. 1865. She turned the dial. Click, click, click. The heavy latch gave way with a soft thud. Inside were stacks of cash, property deeds, and a small black leather-bound book. Nico snatched it, flipping it open. It was a ledger. Names, payments, signatures, some marked with a single, chilling red X. This is it, he breathed. Everything. The bribes, the land grabs, the men he silenced. Look at this, Leona whispered, pulling out a folded yellowed page tucked into the back of the book. It was a letter, her mother's handwriting. He found it, she said, her breath catching in her throat. He kept it, to make sure no one else would ever know the truth. Now we do, Nico said, taking the letter, and that's when they heard the click of a hammer being cocked. A voice cut through the silence, cold and sharp. Drop it, both of you. They turned slowly. Sheriff Rook Lyle stood in the doorway, his revolver aimed steady at Nico's chest. Behind him, 2 deputies, their faces grim, their own guns drawn. Knew you'd come crawling back, girl, Rook sneered. Nico glanced at Leona. Her face was pale, but her eyes were clear. There was no fear in them anymore. Only ice. And as her fingers slipped slowly, deliberately into the pocket of her coat, reaching for the small pistol Nico had given her that morning, he realized something profound. She wasn't a victim anymore. She was a survivor, and the fight was just getting started. The moment froze, stretched thin as a spider's thread. Gunmetal glinted in the lantern light. Leona's fingers, hidden from their view, closed around the cold grip of the pistol. Nico's weight shifted, a subtle animal movement, as he calculated the distance, the angles, the seconds. Sheriff Rook Lyle was no fool. He'd been Judge Dane's personal hatchet man for a decade. "Step away from the safe," Rook growled, his eyes flicking from Nico to Leona. "You're both under arrest. Trespass, theft, and sedition." "Sedition?" Leona's voice was shockingly steady. "What law book did you dig that one out of, Rook? My father's?" "You're not a Dane anymore, sweetheart," Rook sneered, taking a step into the room. The deputies fanned out behind him. "That name was your shield. It's gone." Nico spoke then, his voice low and dangerous, like the rumble of distant thunder. "She's not the one who should be arrested." Rook's eyes narrowed into slits. "You just don't know when to die, do you, Apache?" There were no more words. Leona moved first. In a motion so fast it was a blur, she dropped to one knee and pivoted, bringing the pistol out of her coat. The first shot cracked through the silent house, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. The deputy on the right cried out, his arm jerking as the bullet tore through his shoulder. The other deputy lunged, but Nico was faster. He moved like lightning, grabbing the heavy oil lamp from the judge's desk and hurling it. Glass shattered against the wall. Oil splashed across the velvet curtains, and flame erupted, a hungry orange beast that roared to life, instantly filling the room with thick, acrid smoke. The sheriff stumbled back, momentarily blinded, as the fire clawed its way up the wall behind him. Nico used the opening, slamming his shoulder into the lunging deputy, driving him backward into a massive bookshelf. Wood splintered. A cascade of heavy law books rained down, and the man went down under the weight of the very laws he was supposed to uphold. Rook recovered, firing a wild shot that splintered the doorframe inches from Nico's head. Then Nico was on him. His knife was in his hand, a flash of silver and fury in the flickering firelight. They crashed to the floor, wrestling through the smoke, the sheriff screaming as Nico's blade opened a deep gash along his ribs. "Run!" Nico roared at Leona over the crackle of the flames. But she didn't run. She stood her ground, firing again, this time hitting the first deputy in the leg as he tried to struggle to his feet. Then she turned, snatched the black ledger from the open safe, and sprinted to Nico's side. Together they burst out of the study and through the front door, leaving the chaos behind them. Smoke was already pouring from the shattered windows as they tore across the lawn and into the darkness of the orchard. Ghost was waiting where they'd left him, his eyes wide with the scent of fire. Nico threw Leona into the saddle and swung up behind her, just as more shouts erupted from the burning estate. Lanterns bobbed in the darkness. More gunshots cracked the night air. A bullet sang past Nico's ear, ripping through the collar of his coat. He spurred Ghost forward, and they vanished into the trees. The hooves of the Mustang were a thunderous drumbeat against the dry earth. Behind them, the great white manor of the Dane estate burned, a funeral pyre for a lifetime of lies. They didn't stop riding until the first pale fingers of dawn streaked the eastern sky. They found shelter in a half-collapsed barn on the edge of an abandoned ranch, a skeleton of a building hidden between two low ridges. Leona slid from the saddle, her face pale, her hands trembling with adrenaline. "You're bleeding," she said, her voice sharp with concern. Nico looked down. A dark stain was spreading across his side, seeping from under his coat. "It's not bad," he muttered, but the words were a lie. "Sit," she ordered, her tone leaving no room for argument. He didn't fight her. She tore strips from the lining of her dress, her movements surprisingly deft. She cleaned the wound with a splash of whiskey from an old flask she found in a dusty saddlebag. Her hands shook, but her purpose was steady. "Does it hurt?" she asked, her eyes focused on her work. He managed a faint, grim smile. "Yes. Good." Once she had the bleeding slowed, she tied off the makeshift bandage and sat back on her heels, wiping a bead of sweat from her brow. "We almost died." "But we didn't," he said, meeting her gaze. "You didn't hesitate back there." He looked away, his jaw tight. "I knew what we were walking into. Just didn't expect the fire." Leona held up the black book, its leather cover singed at the edges. "This changes everything." "It proves everything," Nico corrected her. "Land theft, bribery, hired killings. He's been laundering it all through the church, through political favors." She stared down at the spidery handwriting, the lists of names. "These men, they've run this territory for 20 years. Not anymore," Nico said. "So what now?" she asked, looking up at him. "We can't go to the law in Red Bluff. They are the law. Then we go somewhere else. There's a circuit judge in Santa Fe, an honest one. I wrote escort for him once. His name is Hurst. He'll listen if we can get this evidence to him." "Santa Fe? Nico, that's a week's ride. And your wound." "I'll manage," he said. She reached out, her fingers gently brushing his uninjured arm. "You saved me," she whispered. He finally met her eyes, the guard he always kept up, lowered for just a fraction of a second. "I've been saving you for a long time," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he couldn't name. "You just didn't know it." Later that night, as they lay in the hayloft of the ruined barn, Leona couldn't sleep. The silence was heavy, broken only by the soft whistle of the wind through the broken boards and the slow, ragged sound of Nico's breathing. "Why?" she asked quietly into the darkness. "Why do you care what happens to me? You could have just walked away." He was quiet for so long, she thought he was asleep. Then he spoke, his voice low. "Because I saw you." "What do you mean?" "The first time, 9 years ago. You were in the orchard, reading a book. You looked up at me, and you saw a person, not an Apache, not the judge's dog, just a person. No one else ever did that." She exhaled slowly. "You think that's love?" "I don't know what it is," he admitted, "but it was enough to keep me from becoming like them." She reached over in the dark, her hand finding his wounded side. He flinched slightly at her touch. "You could still die from this." "I've died before," he murmured, his voice laced with a weariness that went bone deep. "Just not all at once." She smiled faintly in the darkness. "That's a very Apache thing to say. I'm a very Apache man." She leaned closer, her lips brushing his forehead in a gesture that was both tender and heartbreaking. She lay back down beside him, her hand resting gently over his. Outside, the wind howled through the ruins, a lonely, mournful sound. The wolves were coming for them. But for tonight, huddled together in the bones of what once was, they had found a fragile peace. The first 2 days on the trail to Santa Fe were a fever dream of sun and dust. Nico pushed them relentlessly, guiding ghosts through dry creek beds and forgotten game trails, his eyes constantly scanning the ridgelines behind them. The sun was a hammer, and the wind was a whip, flaying them with sand until the world was a blurred, shimmering haze. Leona rode behind him, her arms wrapped tightly around his waist, her face pressed against his back. It wasn't a grip of fear anymore. It was a grip of pure, bone-deep exhaustion. Every muscle in her body screamed in protest, but she never uttered a single word of complaint. By the second night, Nico was swaying in the saddle. They found a derelict sheep herder's cabin tucked into a rocky canyon of piñon pines. The roof was half gone, but the stone walls offered a shield against the biting wind. As Leona got a small fire going in the broken hearth, Nico slid from the saddle and collapsed onto the dirt floor, sweat pouring from his temples. "You're burning up," she murmured, her cool hand on his forehead confirming her fears. "I've had worse," he rasped. "That's not an answer," she shot back. She boiled water, tore more strips from her now tattered dress, and gently peeled back the makeshift bandage. The wound was angry, red, and swollen. She ground up some dried sage from a pouch on Nico's belt, mixing it with a little water to make a bitter poultice, and pressed it against his skin. He didn't flinch, but she saw the muscles in his jaw clench tight. "I don't want you to die before we get there," she said, her voice low. His eyes, glassy with fever, found hers. "You didn't used to care." She looked up sharply, hurt flashing in her eyes. That's not fair. His expression softened. I know. They sat in silence, the only sound the crackle of the fire. The wind moaned through the pines outside, sounding like ghosts whispering warnings. Do you think they're close? Leona asked. Nico nodded, his head leaning back against the cold stone wall. If not now, then soon. Rook is too proud to stop chasing. And the judge, he's too afraid of this book getting out. She clutched the black ledger to her chest. I remember thinking I would marry into safety, she said quietly, staring into the flames. That was the promise. But every man at that party, every single one, looked at me like I was a column in a business ledger. Nico's voice was a low rumble from the shadows. You deserve better than promises made by men who hide knives behind their backs. She looked at him, a question in her eyes. Do you believe people can change, Nico? He was quiet for a long time, considering the question. No, he said at last, but I believe they can choose who they become next. They rode out at dawn. The fever had broken, and while pain was still etched on his face, Nico sat straighter in the saddle. Leona's pistol was no longer hidden in her coat. It was strapped to her hip, a silent declaration. They crossed into New Mexico territory by mid-morning, the landscape changing, flattening out into vast empty plains before rising again into red hills and deep arroyos. Trouble found them at midday on the third day. They came fast. 4 riders, their faces covered with bandanas, their guns already drawn. These weren't lawmen. They were mercenaries, their movements efficient and deadly. One of them raised a rifle and fired a warning shot that kicked up dust just inches from Ghost's hooves. Nico reacted instantly, wheeling Ghost hard and spurring him up into a cluster of sandstone rocks. They dismounted in a flash, taking cover behind a low ledge. Leona dropped beside him, her heart hammering against her ribs. They're not trying to arrest us, Nico muttered, peering over the rock. They don't care if they shoot first. Gunfire cracked overhead, sending a spray of rock fragments into their faces. Leona flinched, then reached for her pistol. Nico stopped her. No, take this. He pushed his spare rifle into her hands. His eyes were intense. You know how to shoot. No, she said, her voice trembling slightly. But I know how to aim. Good enough, he said. Wait for my signal. Don't fire unless they get close. He began to crawl away along the ridge, disappearing into the brush like smoke. 2 of the gunmen advanced on their position, moving with a reckless confidence. One of them even lit a cigar, a lazy grin on his face. He never saw Nico. A shadow detached itself from the rocks behind him. A swift, brutal blow to the throat. A knife sliding home. The gunman dropped without a sound. His partner turned at the noise just in time to take a fist-sized rock to the face. Nico was on him before he hit the ground, a single punch ending the fight. Gunfire erupted from the other side as the last 2 gunmen opened fire on Leona's position. She pressed herself against the rock, the rifle shaking in her hands. She waited, just as he'd told her. Waited until they broke cover and started to advance. Then she rose, brought the rifle to her shoulder, and fired. The kick of it almost knocked her over, but the shot was true. One of the men screamed and tumbled backward, clutching a shattered shoulder. The last man, seeing his friends go down, turned to run. Nico dropped him from 100 yards away, a clean shot through the calf. Nico returned to her side, breathing hard. She lowered the rifle, her arms aching. I only meant to scare him, she said, looking at the wounded man writhing on the ground. Nico took the rifle from her. You did, he said, his gaze serious, but you can't keep thinking fear is enough to stop men like this. Leona looked down at her hands. They weren't shaking anymore. Then I'll learn, she said. That night they camped in a dry canyon that felt like the surface of the moon, surrounded by towering rock spires. As Nico sharpened his knife by the fire, Leona was reading through the black book again. Suddenly she looked up. There's a name in here I recognize. Judge Hurst. The judge. He always said Hurst was the one man in the territory he couldn't buy. Incorruptible. Nico paused his work. Then maybe he's the one we need. She nodded. It says here he has a homestead just outside Santa Fe, a day's ride from the capital. Nico tied a new leather thong to the handle of his blade. Then that's where we go. She closed the book, a new resolve in her eyes. I don't want to just hand this over to him, Nico. I want to testify. I want them all to hear the truth from my own lips. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and saw the transformation was complete. You're not the girl I carried out of that cave. She reached out, her fingers tracing the scar on his arm. And you're not the man who stood in the shadows anymore. He covered her hand with his. It wasn't love blooming between them. Not yet. It was something stronger. Loyalty, respect, a bond forged in blood and fire. They reached Judge Hurst's homestead at dusk the next evening. It was a simple ranch house made of adobe and stone, nestled in a grove of old cottonwood trees. There were no guards, no gates, just a man with silver hair and tired eyes sitting on his porch, a journal in his lap. Judge Hurst, Leona called as she dismounted, her boots sinking into the soft dust. The old man looked up, his eyes sharp and intelligent. You're Dane's girl. She walked forward, holding the black book in her hand like a shield. Not anymore. Behind her, Nico remained mounted, a silent sentinel watching the horizon. We need 10 minutes of your time, Leona said. That's all. The judge looked from her face, to the book, to the dangerous-looking man on the horse. He sighed, closed his journal, and motioned toward the chair opposite him. 10 minutes, he said. He took the book. He started reading, and for a very long time, he didn't look up. The sky over Santa Fe was pale gold and slate blue. In the quiet courtyard of Judge Hurst's adobe estate, even the cicadas were holding their breath. Nico stood by the arched gate, his rifle held loosely in his hands, his gaze fixed on the distant road. The town below was waking up. So was the danger. Inside, Leona sat across a heavy oak table from the judge. The black book lay open between them. Hurst had been reading all night, his face growing grimmer with every turned page. I knew Dane was ambitious, Hurst said finally, his voice a low rumble. I did not know he was a traitor to every law this territory was built on. Leona's hands were clasped so tightly in her lap her knuckles were white. Can you bring it to court? I can, Hurst said, his tired eyes meeting hers. But it won't be easy. Dane has paid off half the circuit. He has friends in the territorial office. Even here in Santa Fe, this will be a fight. I'll testify, she said, her voice unwavering. I will name every man, every deal, every crime he ever committed. Hurst studied her for a long moment. You understand what you're asking for, child? They will try to destroy you on that stand. They already tried to destroy me, she replied. They failed. He gave a single, decisive nod. Then we ride for the Capitol at dusk. I'll have you both under federal protection until the hearing. Leona felt a wave of relief so profound it almost made her dizzy. Just then, Nico entered the room, closing the heavy door behind him. His face was grim. They're here, he said. Hurst looked up, alarmed. Who? Rook and 4 riders. I saw them on the southern ridge an hour ago. They're not waiting for an invitation. Hurst stood, his age falling away from him. I'll call for the marshals. You don't have time, Nico said flatly. They'll make their move before the marshals can get here. The judge looked from Nico's stony face to Leona's determined one. Then we hold them off. The afternoon passed in a tense, stretched-out silence. Judge Hurst armed his 2 oldest ranch hands, and they barricaded the main gate with a heavy wagon. Leona helped pack the pages of the ledger into a waterproof satchel, her hands moving with a steady purpose. Nico cleaned and oiled the rifles, his movements economical and precise. I thought it would feel more triumphant, Leona said quietly as she methodically pushed bullets into a Winchester. Justice never does, Nico replied without looking up. It's just a quieter kind of violence. She stopped what she was doing and turned to him, her eyes searching his face. Do you think we'll survive this? I think, he said, finally meeting her gaze. We've already survived worse. She nodded, and for a moment, that was enough. They heard the sound of hooves at twilight. Not a charge, but a slow, stalking approach. 5 riders moving through the brush at the edge of the property, using the fading light as cover. They're waiting for full dark, Nico said, watching from a crack in the stable wall. Then we move first, Hurst muttered, handing Nico a rifle. If they want blood, they'll find mine doesn't come cheap. Leona moved to stand behind Nico, strapping her pistol securely to her hip. I'm not hiding, she said. He turned, his expression hard. You should. No, she said, her voice firm. If this is the end, I want to face it on my feet. He stared at her for a second, then gave a curt nod. Then don't hesitate. I won't. The first shot came just as the sun slid below the horizon, painting the clouds in fiery streaks of red and orange. One of Rook's men, hidden behind a mesquite tree, fired at the house. The bullet thudded into the adobe wall beside the front door. Nico returned fire instantly, a single perfect shot that sent the man tumbling backward into the dust. Then all hell broke loose. Gunfire erupted from 3 different directions. Dust and smoke filled the air. A second man made a rush for the fence, but one of Hurst's ranch hands cut him down. Inside the gate, Leona crouched behind an overturned water trough, her pistol drawn, her breath coming in fast, sharp gas, but her hands were steady. Rook and another rider broke from cover, charging toward the side of the house. Nico met them head on. He launched himself from the stable roof, a blur of buckskin and steel, landing on the second rider and knocking him clean from his horse. He rolled and came up facing Rook. The sheriff pulled his horse to a skidding halt, his face a mask of fury. You should have stayed on your damn reservation, he spat. Never had one, Nico replied. The 2 men lunged at each other. It wasn't a gunfight. It was a brawl. A brutal, desperate clash of fists and elbows and rage. Nico's side wound, barely healed, tore open again, but he didn't slow. He ducked under a wild swing from Rook, slammed his forearm into the sheriff's throat, and used his momentum to drive them both to the ground. Rook's pistol flew from his hand, skittering across the dirt. Leona saw it. She ran, scooping up the gun just as Rook scrambled to his feet behind Nico. Blood dripped from the sheriff's mouth, his eyes wild with hate. He pulled a knife from his boot and lunged at Nico's exposed back. And froze. Leona stood 5 feet away, the heavy revolver leveled at his chest. Don't, she said, her voice as cold as a grave. For a split second, Rook hesitated. He saw the girl from the engagement party, the judge's pretty silent daughter, and he made his final mistake. He lunged anyway. The shot was the last sound the battle ever heard. It echoed across the valley like a final, cracking breath. Rook dropped to his knees, a look of pure, dumb surprise on his face. He looked down at the hole in his chest, then back up at Leona. Then he collapsed forward into the dust. The violence ended as quickly as it began. The 2 remaining riders, seeing their leader fall, turned and fled into the night. The courtyard was littered with shell casings and the metallic scent of blood. Leona dropped the pistol, her hands finally starting to shake. Nico was at her side in an instant, catching her before she could fall. I didn't want to, she whispered, her face buried in his chest. But you did what you had to, he said, his voice rough. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with a terrible new understanding. Does that make me like them? No, he said, holding her tight. It makes you free. 3 days later, Leona stood before the territorial court in Santa Fe. Judge Hurst presented the evidence from the Black Book. Then Leona took the stand. With a clear, steady voice, she told them everything. She named every man, detailed every crime, and named her own father as the architect of it all. The courtroom sat in stunned, absolute silence. Within a week, it was over. Warrants were issued, assets were frozen, the Dane estate was seized by the federal government. Judge Dane was arrested without a fight. Leona refused to attend the sentencing. She waited outside the courthouse, where Nico stood leaning against a stone pillar, watching the morning sun climb over the city. When she stepped out into the light, she didn't say a word. She just walked straight to him, wrapped her arms around his chest, and held on as if he were the only solid thing left in the world. What now? He asked softly. We go, she whispered into his shirt. Anywhere. Somewhere the road is long, and the past can't catch us. They left that night. No goodbyes, no grand farewells. Just a man, a woman, and a single horse, their saddlebags filled with the heavy weight of truth. They rode west, away from the blood and the memories, chasing a kind of peace that no law could ever grant them. And as the stars wheeled in the vast, silent sky above, Nico reached over and took her hand. This time Leona didn't let go. They rode south, then west, until the land changed again. The tall pines gave way to mesquite, and brittle brush. The stars at night seemed to hang lower, brighter, as if daring them to look up. In a dusty town near the border, they traded Ghost for two sturdy, nameless horses and a small pouch of coins. They kept riding until the whispers of Red Bluff were finally swallowed by the vast, indifferent silence of the desert. They found it in a small valley outside a forgotten town called Socorro del Norte, a crumbling adobe shack, half swallowed by the dust it was made from, a tiny stream that still trickled with clear water, and a grove of ancient cottonwood trees that turned the moonlight to silver. It wasn't a home, but it was a place to stop running. The first few weeks were a different kind of hard, a quiet, aching hardness. They rebuilt the shack with their own hands, hands still calloused from holding guns. Nico hunted, teaching Leona how to skin a rabbit, how to move through the brush without making a sound. She learned the rhythms of the land, planting a small garden of beans and squash, her fingers digging into the cool, dark earth. They didn't talk about the judge, or the fire, or the trial that had turned her name to ash. But sometimes in the quiet moments, as Leona stirred a pot over their small fire, or Nico mended a tear in his coat by the fading light, their eyes would meet. And in that shared glance was a universe of understanding. They had survived. Not just the bullets and the knives, but the rot, the poison that had lived in their own hearts, the doubt, the fear, the what-ifs. One evening, as they watched the smoke from their chimney curl up into the purple dusk, she asked him, "Do you think we'll ever be good again?" Nico looked at her for a long time. "We were never bad," he said simply, "just broken." One morning, they woke to the sound of a single horse approaching. Nico grabbed his rifle and stood in the doorway, a silent shadow. A U.S. Marshal, his coat caked with dust, reined in his horse a few yards away. He tipped his hat. "Morning," he said. Nico didn't reply. The Marshal's eyes glanced past him, catching sight of Leona in the cabin's shadow. "I come with news, not trouble," he said. "Judge Hurst asked me to find you. Thought you should know." Leona stepped out into the light. "Know what?" The Marshal pulled a folded paper from his coat, an official notice. "Dane died in the territorial prison, a knife in the yard. He never said another word." Leona's face was a mask. She gave nothing away. "He left no will, no recognized heir," the Marshal continued. "The estate's been dissolved. The funds are being used for reparations, land claims for the families he ruined." He looked from one to the other. "That's all I came to say. Good day to you." He turned his horse and rode off without another word. Only after the dust had settled did Leona speak. "I don't feel anything." "You're not supposed to," Nico said gently. "That's what grief is when it's all used up." That night she sat beneath the cottonwood trees, the wind rustling the silver leaves above her. "He hated me because I reminded him of her," she whispered. "My mother. But I can't even remember her face. I only remember how cold his was." Nico sat beside her, his shoulder a warm, solid presence in the darkness. He didn't offer empty words of comfort. He just sat with her, sharing the silence. "Is this enough?" she asked, her voice small. "A life like this, hiding out here, living in inches instead of miles?" He didn't hesitate. "It's not hiding," he said. "It's choosing." She looked at him, her eyes tired but finally, truly alive. "I used to think I was meant for something important, something grand." He took her hand, his calloused thumb tracing patterns on her skin. "You are," he said. "You're here. You're still standing. That's as important as it gets." Over the next few months, the shack became a home. The land began to give back more than it took. They got chickens, then two stubborn goats. Nico built a corral from scavenged deadwood. Leona sewed curtains from old flour sacks. Once a month, they would ride to town for supplies. Two quiet strangers in a town full of quiet strangers. No one asked questions they didn't want answered. And then people started to find them. Drifters, travelers, women with no names running from lives they couldn't bear. They never turned anyone away. A meal, a safe place to sleep for a night or two. No judgment, no sermons. One girl, no more than 16, arrived barefoot and bleeding. Leona washed her feet herself. The girl left 2 days later without a word, but she left behind a single silver earring on the table. Leona pinned it to the wall. We're building a church, she joked one evening. Nico smiled. Not the kind you kneel in. Then came the baby. It wasn't theirs. Just a basket, left on their doorstep at dawn, wrapped in a threadbare army coat. Inside, a tiny whimpering child. No note. Leona stared down at the infant for a long time, her expression unreadable. Then she bent down and lifted the basket into her arms. She never asked who the mother was or why she had left. She just fed the baby goat's milk from a scrap of cloth and held her through the night. They named her Clara. By the time spring came, the scars on their souls had begun to fade. Leona planted wildflowers by the creek, bright, defiant patches of color in the harsh landscape. Nico carved a cradle from a single piece of cottonwood, his rough hands moving with surprising gentleness. One night, under a sky so full of stars it looked like spilled diamonds, they sat outside while Clara slept peacefully between them. She'll never know what we came from, Leona said. She doesn't need to, Nico replied. Leona smiled. I hope she grows up wild. She will, he said, but not lost. They watched the fire burn down to glowing embers. Then Nico turned to her, his voice low. I never told you. Told me what? When I first saw you, in the orchard, you were reading that book. You wore a red dress. You had dirt on your knees. A soft, sad smile touched her lips. I remember the dress. I didn't know you were watching. I always was, he said. She took his hand, and this time, they did kiss. It wasn't a kiss of passion or desperation. It was a kiss of arrival, a quiet, certain thing, born not from a story's end, but from the silence that had finally grown soft enough to hold it. And there, in that forgotten stretch of high desert, two broken people built a different kind of justice, not with bullets or laws, but with presence, with staying, with a small, steady fire that didn't burn the world down, but offered just enough light to find your way home. Thank you for listening all the way to the end of this story. Your time and attention mean the world to me. If this story of survival and justice found its way into your heart, please take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It lets me know you're out there, and it allows me to keep bringing these stories to life. We'll see you in the next one.